Hi, this is a presentation created for the Festival of Teaching and Learning at the University of Alberta 2022. So what I'd like to do is describe some of my adventures into remote experiential learning as seen through the lens of the replication crisis in empirical science. And specifically, we'll talk about the content of a cognitive psychology course that has been running for 3 semesters starting in the fall 2021. Before I begin, what I'd also like to do is acknowledge the contributions of Dr. Peggy St. Jacques, Dr. Julia Spaniol, Dr. Graham Hull, Yemen, Lynn Sage, Enchan, Arturo, Yafei, Michelle, and Yaching, who've all served as teaching assistants on this course. So let's set the scene. First of all, what I'll do is I will describe the technicalities of how to implement a mobile phone technology into the specific cognitive psychology course that was run and the reason for doing so. What I'll then also do is provide a sample of the results that we got across those 3 semesters. What I'll do is I'll describe something that result in cognitive psychology that seems to be reliable, a result that seems to be reliably unreliable, and perhaps something new in the data as well. And then I'll also talk about the pros and cons of using this kind of scheme in the context of higher education learning. So to set the scene, if this course was running in person, what we would do is we would try to recreate classic and contemporary cognitive psychology findings within class and as a group. These were often quite ramshackled affairs, lacking perhaps some of the internal rigor that we might expect from actual experimentation, but they were rough and ready estimates of the kinds of things that we were describing in the content material. So to translate that to a remote experiential learning experience, I used the platform of Presentation Mobile. Now this is useful because this is a platform that we use in person in the lab when we are able to test in person, and this is a mobile phone version of that platform. So the procedure goes that you would write a script within Presentation that would then pack itself up as a secure package that would go to the Presentation encrypted servers. What participants, or in this case students, would do is would download the package on their mobile phone device, iOS or Android. They would interact with the particular package. The information that they provided from that package would then get put back into the encrypted server, so their data would be automatically uploaded, and then I would, at a later date, locally decrypt that data and then integrate that data into the course material. So these were known as Flex Labs, these mobile phone interactions, and participants would have 1 week to engage approximately about 5 to 6 minutes each week with this mobile phone technology. So there was a flexibility in terms of when participants or students took part. What we would do is that would close down on the Sunday, a new lab would open up on the Monday, and then our team would be involved with processing all of that data. So our classes were tended to be in between 200 and 300 participants. We would process all that data on the Monday, and then for our interactive session that would run on the Tuesday, we would integrate that material into the course content. So for example, in the first case, there's a Flex Lab regarding selecting the preferred face that has the greatest degree of emotion. And these are slightly oddly designed faces, which we'll talk about in a moment. But this feeds into the relationship between brain structure and function. So the idea is emotion processed by a certain hemisphere of the brain, or is there a specialization with respect to that processing? So do the data related to the processing of emotion support the hypotheses that we know in cognitive neuroscience, specifically related to hemispheric specialization, and so on. What students would then be invited to do is they would select one of these 8 Flex Labs. So there are 9 Flex Labs in total, 2 related to one topic. So that results in 8 studies that are carried out across the course, and then students select one of those Flex Labs to write up as their written assignment. So let's take a little look at 3 examples. So I already hinted at this in the previous discussion, but the question is, using pairs of chimeric faces, do individuals prefer the left side of the face for the expression of emotion? And this might implicate the right hemisphere. So we took stimuli that were these chimeric faces, 2 images of the same individual, one providing a neutral expression, one providing a emotional expression, chop that face down the middle, and then separate out those 2 versions. So we have somewhat oddly perceived happiness on one side, neutral on the other, neutral on the left side here, or happiness on the right. You get pairs of those faces and you're asked to just select one. Which face is happier? If you're selecting images where, if you have a bias for selecting images where the left side of the face is happy, that shows an implication potentially of the right hemisphere. So in the original study, which was back from 1983 with 111 participants, they showed support of that hypothesis across 3 semesters, starting formally in winter 2021 and finishing in winter 2022. Using about 550 participants, we were able to provide reliable support of that hypothesis. And a note that the effect sizes tend to be smaller than those published, which is somewhat of a common finding in the literature. Nevertheless, we do have a reliable replication of the FACES lab. A second example is in the context of memory and learning. So specifically related to the acquisition of knowledge, and also the more practical question of how well students do during multiple choice questions, we asked the following: what kind of feedback is better? And there's an intriguing observation published in 2005 by Paschler and colleagues that suggests that sometimes no feedback is actually better than some kind of feedback. So in this particular graph that I'm showing you here, and we can focus in on the middle line, the provision of the correct answer, if you're answering questions, seems to be always best, followed by no feedback, followed by telling people whether they got it correct or incorrect. You can see that the y-axis here is the percentage correct. So this was an intriguing finding, and we note in the paper the following note. So for the original paper, this was based on the acquisition of a secondary language, but the authors claim that this basic pattern of results was confirmed in another quite similar online experiment where we carried out teaching participants obscure facts rather than foreign language vocabulary, using a within rather than between manipulation of the type of feedback. So this almost simple throwaway note in the published paper was used exactly as the basis for our FlexLab on trivia. So for individuals, we're provided with 60 multiple choice questions, delivering 3 different kinds of feedback, and then those trivia questions were answered again straight away. And we're looking to see what kind of feedback supports the idea of knowledge retention. And specifically, we're looking at the idea that the provision of no feedback is actually better than the provision of correct or incorrect feedback. So because this is a throwaway comment, and this is a kind of a reminder that the more you can provide materials in terms of what you did, providing the scripts, providing the data, providing the instructions, much better in terms of enabling folks to exactly replicate what you did, so we can strengthen the robustness of science here. So we don't know what the effect size was, but there is a claim that this was in support of no feedback being better than correct or incorrect feedback. We find very robust data to the contrary. So once again, this is collected across 550 participants, 3 semesters in an online setting. So we fail to support this claim. And finally, in the context of divided attention in class, we talk about something known as the dual task decrement. This is the idea that if you're, say, for example, trying to write an essay and also watching TV at the same time, there's going to be a dual task decrement. Because you're trying to do two things at once, the performance on these tasks is going to suffer a dual task decrement. Now, what was intriguing for us in the context of this discussion was an observation made in 2010 where there was a dual task facilitation. And this is the perhaps everyday or quotidian observation that maybe when you're on the phone, you often tend to doodle at the same time if you have a pen handy. Why should that be so? And the idea is that perhaps doodling maintains an intermediate level of arousal that actually facilitates performance with respect to remembering what your phone conversation was about. So, as a way of dividing attention, we ask the question, does doodling at the same time help to retain information about a phone message using the scripts and general scheme of the original Andready 2010 paper? So this was a between students' design. One group doodled while listening to a phone message. Another group didn't doodle while listening to the same message. The data show support of this idea. We show consistent refutation of that particular idea. This does not, at least from our perspective, appear to be a novel example of a dual task facilitation, consistent with the rest of the literature on a dual task decrement. So what are some of the pros and cons of this scheme? So I think some of the pros are that being able to connect with students via mobile phone technology, sort of we go to students where they already are, and particularly these Flex Labs provide remote interactive windows that are flexible. Students can connect with the course material at any time during the week. Given the structure of the syllabus, what we're doing is we're reconnecting material across different weeks as well, which preserves some of the spirit of distributed learning. There's also built into the syllabus the principle of self-selection, in that participants engage and resolve 8 of these Flex Labs, and then they decide on the one that they liked the most or understood the most and select that for their written assignment. So this can lead to empowerment of student via selected material. And I think also it enables a meta-discussion within class and more broadly of the degree to which science is in a replication crisis. And it also gives rise fundamentally, I think, to the idea that there was a wholesale reconfiguration of teaching and learning as a result of the global health crisis, where much of the data, the teaching and research took place online relative to in person. So the question is, does being in person act as a necessary condition for replication? Is being online now an auxiliary assumption that we have to build in to attempts at replication? If we fail to replicate, is it because we were online? So this really now gives rise to a broader discussion of the mode of delivery when we're collecting data as well. Cons of the scheme. Well, the scheme was not free. Few things are, and it cost around $800, so about 1,000 Canadian dollars per year to host those laboratories on the servers. There was lots of additional work prior to the rollout of these kinds of schemes. There was a semester where we also piloted this to try and iron out the kinks. There was also the provision of additional educational material. So in addition to providing technical support and having to do the programming, we also offered in the spirit of accessibility alternative versions for students who didn't have mobile phones, and they were also able to opt out of the scheme as well and do alternative educational activities. There were some difficulties in terms of integrating the statistics and interpreting the statistics, given this was a second level cognitive psychology course. So there were some prior assumptions that were made about all students had to take Stat 151. So some of that material that we hope is carried forward from semester and from year might have been a little rusty. I think this is now compounded because Stat 151 is now no longer a prerequisite of Psych 258, so we'll have to work around that. And the degree to which this data speak to the replication crisis gives rise to what is a replication anyway. And as I previously mentioned, if you fail to replicate a study, you can always rely on these auxiliary assumptions, such as, well, it was online rather than in person. So being in person is a critical condition for that kind of replication. So it's really getting us to think much more deeply about what a replication is anyway. So hopefully what you've got there is a whistle-stop tour of some of the experiential learning that took place remotely via this cognitive psychology course across 4 semesters, formerly across 3. We used Presentation Mobile as a flexible platform for delivering remote interactive windows, getting students experienced with the kinds of studies, bringing those journal articles to life by re-engaging with exactly those kinds of procedures. We, across 3 semesters, there are about 700 students, and for each of the Flex Labs, we were able to collect approximately a sample size between 550 and 600. And this, on the whole, then did tend to yield reliable data. Whether that data was in support of or in refutation of the hypothesis differed, but it did seem to be consistent across the 3 hypotheses. There's lots of initial work, but I hope that this kind of scheme and other schemes like it offer the opportunity to provide teachable moments, both in terms of the specific course content and also broader scientific issues. So thanks a lot for listening in. You have my email and my Twitter handle below if you want to ask me any additional questions about this. Thanks a lot.